I joined the United States Marine Corps Reserve on 17 September 1961. And for the last 54 years, my government has lied to me. I didn't know it at the time. I was just a young, stupid 17-year-old recruit who, at the completion of my senior year, went off to boot camp and what I thought was going to be a career in the Marine Corps. I was 20 when I made it to Vietnam. Had absolutely no idea that we were using herbicides. None at all. I came home from that tour early because of malaria. Spent 9 weeks in the Naval Hospital in Great Lakes. Went on to another duty station. Re-enlisted because that was the goal for a school. At the conclusion of my school, despite the fact that when I went in, the policy was that you got your choice at duty station if you finished 1, 2, or 3 in the class. Number 1, 2, and 3 in my class, we all wound up in the same unit at Dung Ha. Again, I had no idea we were using defoliant. I came home. I got out. And I realized because of 2 of my children that there was something pretty drastically wrong. It wasn't until about 1981 when I got hooked up with the folks who were putting together what became the New Jersey Agent Orange Commission that I realized that the use of herbicides, particularly Agent Orange, but there were also 17 other herbicides that we used in Vietnam, but mostly Agent Orange, somewhere between 20 and 21 million gallons of that particular herbicide were used over the entire area south of the 17th parallel, South Vietnam. South Vietnam, size-wise, is about the same size as the state of New Jersey, where I live. So to the point of today, we realize that Vietnam is the war that keeps on giving. Because not only do we have our problems, our cancers, our disabilities that arise out of that exposure. For the first time in the history of warfare, we have a second, and what now appears very clearly to us to be a third generation affected by those exposures. And it took my government, as the result of a lawsuit originally filed in 1979 and settled to the detriment of myself and my brother and sister veterans in May of 1985, to come to an understanding of just what the hell went wrong. Every one of us who went across the pond and spent weeks or months or years, you're exposed. Now, the scientists today will tell you that if we tested your blood or your fat tissue, we wouldn't find it. That's true, because it slowly excretes itself out of your body, but not before it does the damage. But when I realized that a very good friend of mine, who holds this country's highest decoration for valor, the Medal of Honor, who is a year and a half younger than I am, who has about the same amount of time in country that I have, has disabilities and maladies out the yin-yang, and I look at him and I look at myself and I say, where are we? And then I realized I had 3 sons. He had 2 sons and a daughter. His kids are perfectly fine. His kids have given him 9 grandchildren. My 2 surviving sons are still fighting their battles. One is going to be 45, the other one's going to be 49. That's the legacy that this experience left us with. Now, a lot of this, over the years that I've been doing this, is directed to the wives and the children. And I know there are some women veterans in here, but I would venture a guess that most of the ladies in the audience are probably spouses or daughters. What I'm saying to you is, the guy in your life is not fouled up because he got old and got angry. He's fouled up because he spent a year in Vietnam and he's still trying to overcome what we were faced with.
I had two or three things I was going to discuss, but I'm probably going to bring it down to one major issue that pertains to me and maybe many others here: birth defects. And I found out about birth defects when my first son was born in 1968. And he had certain issues that we were wondering, where did that come from? No one in the family had things like that. Teeth turning black and falling out, asthma. It just didn't happen. Then, since nothing resonated about Agent Orange or herbicides, we went to try to have another child. That child never made it out. And then another one, a year or two later, that one never made it out. And then, again, my second son was born with a birth defect, which is a defect that we don't have to go into. It was a structural. I guess, lo and behold, wanting to keep the population at the time of the Bronx and then New Jersey growing, we tried to have another child, and that child never made it out. And then my daughter was born after that with numerous female-related issues. Ovary syndrome, polycystic, it's called, small jaw, which wasn't female-related, but was structural-related. She had to have extensive surgeries throughout her life and is still going through it. Now, what really pisses me off at this point is I have 4 grandchildren. My newest grandson is adopted, and he's only 6 months old. My 3 grandchildren are through my offspring. All 3 of them have disabilities related to whether it's ADHD, sensory processing disorders, mood swings, and sometimes not so much violence, but on a 3-year-old shouldn't have such anger at times. So the birth defects mean a lot to me, and I'm still looking not so much for answers, I'm just looking for someone to hit. That's how it is now. And I just get angry when I see it. And what are you going to do? There's nothing to do at this point except do what we do here. Paul mentioned the research, the HR 1769 and S901, those bills for research, that if they get done, if they get passed, it at least move things ahead, maybe not only for us, which might be a little bit late, but for the newer vets, Iraq, Afghanistan. That bill, you guys can correct me after, doesn't pertain to just Vietnam. When I got drafted, I didn't, not like Paul, I didn't plan on spending a career in the military. But who knew that I am spending the rest of my life, since I'm 70, what happened in those years in the military? It never leaves. It doesn't leave you.
It's reasonable, it's very reasonable to say, without a doubt, that every one of those diseases can arise from other causes other than exposure to Agent Orange. And oftentimes when you're faced with an illness, one doesn't know with certainty whether it's related to wartime service or whether the disease would have been caused somewhere else. But the point being is that Mike has said, in many cases, the epidemiology, the science, okay, clearly shows that chronic exposure, in many cases, to 2,4,5-T, which is a component, chemical component of Agent Orange, is associated with illnesses. Soft tissue sarcoma, for example, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is due to the fact that the dioxin contaminant in the 2,4,5-T, okay, has been identified as a causal agent. The last thing I want to address is, as you'll see, and I've said it a couple of times, you'll see the list of diseases, okay, associated with our children in the Agent Orange Guide. There's one, spina bifida, for the children born of male Vietnam veterans exposed to phenoxy herbicides, especially Agent Orange. There's lots for women veterans. Why do you think that is? There were more men who served in Vietnam. More men. That translates to dollars, okay? Not as many women Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange file claims for their kids. It doesn't cost the feds that much money. And I don't care what anybody says anywhere, anytime, when it comes to diseases, diagnoses, treatments, etc., associated with your military service, all right? It's all about the dollar. It's all about the dollar. So I'll bring it full circle and point out that the one thing that's holding up the Senate 901 and H.R. 1769 is OMB. That's the Office of Budget Management. Now, Congress, in its wisdom or lack thereof, all right, says that any bill that goes through, OMB has to take a look at it and score it. How much is it going to cost? Remember I said what I did about money? Okay. So we actually, with the help of the senators, the original senators and House members, sponsors of the bill, with their aides, had written in to both of those pieces of legislation, okay, it's not going to cost any new money. We want the research stuff taken out of the research budget that's already there, because they're not doing any research on our kids and grandkids and the diseases they suffer as a result of our exposure. It's a no-brainer. The money's already there. But the VA stepped in and said, wait a minute, we still have to have OMB take a look at it. Right now, we've got no answer from OMB. And what we have heard, however, is that they're diddling around with making projections. You don't make projections. You either have the cost factors there or not. We're not asking for new money. And so when you do speak to your congresspeople about these pieces of legislation, please remind them we're not asking for new monies. We're asking for it out of the current research budget. It also leads us to discussions about genetically modified organisms. There are people who believe that all GMOs are intrinsically bad. I don't agree with that. I've been eating strawberries grown in the United States for years, as well as potatoes and stuff. Those have been genetically modified for years. And it is a genetic modification to protect those plants from cold. That's why you have strawberries from California in the middle of January. All right? So, that doesn't mean I think that all GMOs are good. The devil's in the details, and we don't have time to go deeply into this particular issue, but my colleague, Kelly, Professor Kelly, will talk a little bit about it. My point here is it depends on which GMO you're talking about.
What I hope to show is how what we've heard today plays a part within a much larger picture. So kind of what we've heard here is about the complexities of the conversation, just how elusive it is to really get a point across or get an answer to our questions. So I hope that as I talk about our current food system, that we'll see how truly complicated this conversation really is. So what they were doing is that they are forcing on the American farmers to start growing commodity crops in large volumes. And if the small American farmer, and this is usually someone that had, around 50 acres, if they couldn't be a part of that game, they were forced out. So then what happens now is that we go from having farmers who are looking after 50 acres, which with one family and a couple farmhands, that's something that's manageable. So we go from that kind of food production to a food production where you have, say, maybe half a dozen individuals on tractors taking care of thousands of acres of farmland. When you are taking care of thousands of acres of farmland, it is impossible to take care of kind of the pests that arise. It's impossible to go out there and weed. So what we are finding ourselves in now is that that we have this back and forth between two major groups. We have those who are talking for science, I suppose, talking for the chemical use, saying that it's safe, and then we have those who are saying that it's not safe and that we need to go 100% organic. What we start having here is kind of this war of language in Washington about like what can and cannot be used. And unfortunately, what has happened is that companies like Monsanto, Dow, and DuPont, they've got all the money. Unfortunately, what is happening is that as you're making your progress by going in through the front door, companies like Monsanto and Dow and their and their constituents, they're coming in through the back door, and they're setting up policies usually through the EPA and the USDA to kind of muddy the language a bit so that way your argument can never gain any traction. See, the United States is much different than our global counterparts. Canada and most industrialized countries in Europe have banned 2,4-D. They have banned the use of it until the proper amount of testing has been done to prove that it is safe. So the philosophy of these countries is, you've got this thing, you need to prove to me that it's good before we'll put it into service out in our fields. in the United States, thanks to the legislation of these predominant chemical companies, our philosophy is, you need to prove to me that it's bad so that I don't.
Next question, I'm going to combine two different diseases or conditions. Has anything shown that Agent Orange and infertility are related in men, okay, or even women who served over there, I'll add, okay? And is Agent Orange in some way associated with hepatitis C? And I'll modify that to say the conditions that are kind of related to hepatitis C.
Mike answered the first part of the question earlier. If you consider damaged sperm as part of the infertility problem, then yes. I mean, that only makes sense. As far as Hep C and exposure to Agent Orange, no. Hep C is a virus that, as a matter of fact, wasn't discovered until the late 1940s. When it was found, it was called non-Hep A and non-Hep B. Finally, they did whatever they did to give it its official designation. But in any case, it's shown to be not as the result of exposure to pesticides or insecticides, but rather things such as intravenous drug use, dirty needles. There's a small risk of you getting it sexually if one or both partners in the sexual act have open or small cuts or abrasions, transfer of bodily fluids, as we call it. So it's not related to exposure to pesticides or herbicides, but that's another thing that you need to be aware of, because the primary mode of transmission for Hep C is exposure to bodily fluids, which includes blood and other bodily fluids. And for those of us who are medics or corpsmen, it's particularly high risk. And actually, when you compare Vietnam veterans to the rest of the population, and you account for age and gender, we are at the highest risk for Hep C, and that's why we've mounted a national campaign to get tested. But you're going to be asked questions about your sex life, whether you ever used any drugs intravenously. You're going to be asked a lot of questions that you don't want to be asked, but the only way to get to the root of this is to ask those questions. I don't believe that some of them are actually really add anything to it, but at this point, I don't serve on any of those committees that make up those questionnaires.
Okay. And then this one relates to the children, and I think Mike and Paul have actually answered this one before. Is there a connection? And because no studies have been done, we can't say really one way or the other. Is Agent Orange been linked to autism?
As far as I know, it hasn't been linked to autism. But from what I know of what my daughter has found out is that her two boys, my two grandchildren, even though they are not on the autism, well, they are on the spectrum, but it's 0. So it's not, the disorders they have is not, quote, autism. It's, yes, it's on the spectrum, but it's at 0%.
A year ago, there's a group that deals with adding, taking away, expanding definitions of mental health related diseases. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. And there was a new one that came out, okay, a year ago, DSM-5. In the DSM-5, amongst other things, they moved PTSD from anxiety disorders to its own separate section, and that's good. On the other hand, what they did with autism is expanded, all right, the diagnoses, the treatments, the causes, all this kind of thing. And so I would only add to what Mike says is there hasn't been enough research done to show any possible links. So the number that Michael said, it's 0 on the autism spectrum, because that's what they call it when it's a range of illnesses. Some of you know or may have children with very severe autism. Some people have children who have only a couple of things associated with the diagnosis. So that's what he's talking about, the spectrum. And that became part of DSM-5. And my argument is that they need more research.
Okay. I'll preface this question. Agent Orange is composed of several compounds, chief among them 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. They were both used in farming as early as the 40s. 2,4,5-T in 1970, they took it off the market due to its known toxicity, or the suspected toxicity at that time. But 2,4-D is being continued to be used. It's an old standby. It's probably the 5th most used herbicide in farming. Why this renewed interest in 2,4-D? Many of us have heard that as a result of GMO, that this is going to skyrocket. Why this renewed interest in 2,4-D? You want to answer that one, Kelly?
Sure. The interest isn't, like one thing I want to make clear is that the interest isn't just agricultural.
Okay.
As I said before with like Scott's Turf Builder, and they're not the only ones, but that just happens to be the one that's sticking in my brain right now. But it's also being used in lawn care. So to kind of, it's crafty the way that this is being done, because a lot of the publicized concerns are focusing our attention on the farms, which are usually not near us. Okay, so if you're like myself, that I live in the city of Bethlehem, the nearest farm is like 6 miles away from me. So it's not constantly on my radar, but what is not being said is the increased use of 2,4-D in lawn care. But to answer the question specifically, why is there an increase in the amount of 2,4-D in agriculture? Is it because of GMOs? Maybe. But I think mostly it's just because like our policies, the legislation that has led to those policies has just become more complicated. There's more loopholes that work in favor of these chemical companies, and they're writing these policies. Monsanto is, they're at the table when we're coming up with these things. So the regulations are far more relaxed than they have been in the past. So again, they're allowed to essentially do as they want until it's proven that it's a health hazard. And usually by that time it's too late. But that's kind of like why I see the increase in use.
Okay. We mentioned GMO products. One of the questions that was asked, I think we talked about strawberries and corn, but what crops predominantly are now being grown that involve GMO?
There's several GMO crops that the USDA has said it's okay to grow them. I think the last number I saw was something like 86 varieties of edibles and non-edibles. But commercially, I believe there's only 5 that are used. There's corn, soy, alfalfa, papaya, and then the one non-edible is corn. It's not corn, cotton. So those are the ones that we see the most, but the real big one that is out there is corn. And something that we need to be aware of is that this corn just keeps the need for it seems to increase every single year as they find new ways to use it. So I'm sure that many of you who have gone to the pumps, you see that 10% of the fuel that you're putting into your car is with ethanol. That's with GMO corn. So when you fill up your car, you're actually kind of putting money into this whole schism.
As I said earlier, the important thing when you talk to the Congress people, now let me stop there for a minute. Chances are, okay, you're going to be directed to an aide. You're going to be directed to an aide. But those people report to the Congress people, all right? So as part of your call, you need to mention this is no new funding is required, as I said earlier. All right? It's just moving around the current VA research funds for research into this area or into these areas. So, the point being that no matter what I do in Washington, D.C., it's much more effective, okay, if Menendez gets 20 calls from you people in his district than one meeting with Tom Berger, okay, because you vote for him or not. Okay, I guess he's under a little pressure right now. But in any case, okay, Tom doesn't vote for him. My representatives are Mikulski and other people, all right? So, and last but not least, I'll give you the 3 principles, okay, of advocacy. Follow up, follow up, follow up. All right? As Rich said, people will say, well, he or she, meaning Congress people, they think they'll support it, da-da-da. You want a commitment from them that they will support it. And you follow up saying, I talked to whoever a week ago, and you said this. Is this still going to happen? And then you follow up a week later. Okay? You got to nail their hides to the wall. So follow up, follow up, follow up. And remember, okay, no new funds added for this, regardless of what BS the aide or the congressperson gives you. No new funds.
An important part of this, as was mentioned, this is not just an Agent Orange bill. This is also looking out for our brothers and those who have followed after us, the soldiers, sailors, and Marines, and even Air Force, okay, and Coast Guard. You know, Coast Guard does a lot more than a lot of you might think.